Snow fell without mercy. The wind cut through uniforms like knives. Roads disappeared beneath ice, and the forests of Belgium became a frozen labyrinth of death. In December of 1944, as much of the world believed the war in Europe was nearing its end, a brutal surprise erupted from the winter darkness. Nazi Germany launched one last massive offensive, throwing everything it had left into a desperate gamble to break the Allied advance. Caught in the center of that storm was a single American town, Bastogne. Inside it stood exhausted, undersupplied, and outnumbered American soldiers. Around it closed an enemy determined to crush them. What followed was not simply a battle. It was a test of whether American resolve could survive cold, hunger, isolation, and overwhelming force. The Allied armies had been driving east for months. Paris was liberated. German forces were retreating. Many believed victory was only a matter of time. But Hitler had one final plan. A surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies considered too rugged for a major attack. The objective was bold and ruthless: split Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. To do it, Germany assembled hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery in absolute secrecy. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of fog and snow, the attack began. The German assault smashed into thinly held American positions. Units were scattered, communications collapsed, roads jammed with retreating troops and refugees. Panic spread in some areas. But deep in the Ardennes sat Bastogne, a small Belgian town with one strategic value that made it priceless. 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of men, armor, and supplies. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it, and both sides raced toward it through the freezing chaos. Into Bastogne came the men of the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units. Many had been resting or refitting when they were rushed into battle with little preparation. Winter gear was scarce. Ammunition was limited. Food was already running low. Yet they took up defensive positions in the forests and villages surrounding the town, digging foxholes into frozen ground, fortifying crossroads, and preparing to face an enemy that was coming in force. By December 20th, the situation was clear. German divisions had encircled Bastogne. Every road in and out was cut. American units were surrounded by armor, artillery, and infantry. Supplies could no longer reach them by ground. The temperature dropped below freezing, sometimes far below. Snow covered the fields, revealing movement and turning every step into agony. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations without enough bandages or medicine. Food rations were reduced. Ammunition had to be conserved. Yet surrender was not discussed. Bastogne would be held. The Germans believed the Americans were finished. On December 22nd, under a white flag, a German delegation approached American lines and delivered a formal demand for surrender. The message warned that continued resistance would result in annihilation. Inside Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read the demand and gave a response that would become legend. Nuts! When German officers asked for clarification, the American reply was simple and defiant. The message meant absolute refusal. Bastogne would not fall. Not today. Not ever. What followed were days of relentless combat. German forces attacked from every direction, probing for weaknesses, launching assaults against forest positions, villages, and road junctions. Tanks advanced through narrow roads. Infantry moved through snow-covered woods. American paratroopers and armored crews fought in bitter close-quarters combat. Foxholes filled with snow. Weapons froze. Men slept sitting up to avoid freezing to death. Medical personnel operated without heat, sometimes without anesthesia. Supplies were so scarce that artillery units rationed shells. Yet the line did not break. Above the battlefield, the skies were finally clearing. Allied aircraft, grounded for days by heavy fog, returned. Transport planes dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies into Bastogne. Some fell into German lines, some shattered on impact, but enough reached American hands to keep the defense alive. Fighter bombers roared overhead, striking German armor and supply columns, bringing not just firepower but hope to men who had been cut off and surrounded. German commanders intensified their attacks. They knew Bastogne was the key to their entire offensive. Village after village became battlegrounds. At places like Foy, Noville, and Marvy, American soldiers held against repeated assaults, sometimes being pushed back, sometimes counterattacking with whatever strength they had left. Tanks were knocked out at close range. Infantry fought. From house to house, each hour of resistance cost the Germans time they could not afford. Inside Bastogne, the human cost mounted. Frostbite crippled men who had already survived artillery and machine gun fire. Wounded soldiers filled churches, basements, and makeshift hospitals. Chaplains moved among the injured. Medics worked until their hands were numb. And still, the defense held. The men understood that they were not just fighting for a town. They were holding the center of the German offensive. If Bastogne fell, the road to Antwerp could open. If Bastogne held, the enemy's last gamble would collapse. To the south, General George S. Patton was already moving. When the German offensive began, Patton had executed one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in military history, pivoting his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the dead of winter to race north toward Bastogne. Through snow-choked roads, traffic jams, and enemy resistance, his armored columns pushed forward day and night. On December 26, 1944, after days of brutal fighting, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through German lines at the village of Assenois and reached Bastogne. The siege was over. American forces were no longer surrounded. Cheers erupted. Exhausted soldiers wept openly. But the battle itself was far from finished. Fighting would continue in the surrounding area for weeks as Allied forces crushed the German offensive and drove the enemy back. The siege of Bastogne did not end the war by itself, but it broke the heart of Germany's final major attack in the West. The German army had spent men, tanks, and fuel it could never replace. From that moment forward, the path to Germany lay open, and at the center of that turning point stood a town that refused to fall. Bastogne was not a victory defined by conquest. It was a victory of endurance, of discipline under starvation and cold, of leadership under isolation, of men who held their ground when every condition argued that they should collapse. The defense of Bastogne became a symbol of the American fighting spirit, the belief that even when surrounded, outgunned, freezing, and cut off from the world, surrender is not an option. Today, the forests are quiet. Snow still falls on the roads that once shook with artillery and tank fire. But the legacy remains. Bastogne stands as proof that courage is not measured by comfort, and victory is not always about advancing forward. Sometimes victory is simply refusing to give in. In the frozen heart of the Ardennes, when the enemy believed America was finished, American soldiers answered with one word that still echoes through history: nuts.